What's up, YouTube? If you're watching this later on, guys, we're going to talk about something in Stormgate and RTS in general that I feel like maybe people aren't thinking about when they enter these games. And that is a few of the aspects of the maps. So right now what I want to do is go into each of the 1v1 maps here and discuss a few topics, a few points. We might not go into every single one of them because I think that what we're going to talk about is will apply to each one of them, and we don't necessarily need to handhold our way through the entire thing. But let's go into Boneyard. I think this is one of the perfect maps to talk about this, actually. Primarily, we'll just do that. That's fine. Primarily, what I wanted to discuss is expansions, expanding patterns, what we call expansion patterns, and in general, what you should be thinking about when you're expanding. Now, the game is still very new, and we haven't really quite baked out what the standard build orders are going to be. At some point in the future, we are going to have like the standard Infernal opener versus Vanguard. Vanguard's going to have a standard opener versus Celestial. Everyone's just going to have like, this is the standard accepted normal way that you play this race. Right now, what's kind of standard for Infernal is going like Iron Vault, Meat Farm, and then into a Conclave, and then expanding sometime after that. So it's really, a lot of it is based around a few things. Number one is supply. And number two is like your money in game and how quickly you can spend it. So typically in RTS in general, having your money as low as possible is usually pretty good. There are reasons you would want to bank up money. Infernals, for instance, want to bank it up when they're going to try to go for the Flayed Dragon, things like that. But in general, you're trying to spend your money as much as possible because the person who can spend their resources the quickest and who can mine their resources the quickest, or gather resources, since there's creep camps as well in this game, and put that into the game and just pressure their opponent with it, is in general going to win the game. Of course, there's a lot of nuance to it, and there's a lot of other things that go into that too. But one of the things I think about a lot, actually, in Stormgate is the map design and how different the expansion patterns are for these games. So let's take a look at Boneyard, for instance. You start the game, you start every game of Stormgate, you have one base. You just get that. That's for free. And then typically, there is a very obvious base that you're going to expand to next. We usually call that the natural. In StarCraft 2, for instance. I don't know what it's called in other games, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to call it the natural. So the natural on Boneyard is this base here. Typically, it's going to be pretty close by. It's going to be easy for you to get to. It's going to be easy for you to defend. You can see that this has a whole bunch of high ground. It has a ramp. It only has one entrance into the base. In order to get into this side of the base, your opponent has to walk into your main, which is generally considered to be pretty dangerous. So yeah, this is very clear and obviously the first expansion that you would want to go to. And you also get the added benefit of a creep camp here. And I'll talk about expansions in creep camps as well, because I think that these creep camps actually play a huge part in where you want to expand. Now, from this point, it's okay, great. We've got our two bases, right? We have our natural. We can even just take it. From this point, we have a decision that we can make. And this is very typical for StarCraft 2 as well. It is not obvious what your third base should be. So you have two choices. Typically, again, your expansion pattern is going to be closest base, closest base, closest base. But in this situation, we have kind of two choices. And that is, we can either take this base down here, relatively far away, or we can take this base up here. And on this map, both of them might seem pretty awkward. And I see a lot of people go for this one first. So we would call this expansion pattern like the triangle. This would be your triangle third, right? Because you have your main, natural, and then you go over here. This would be a triangle, as you can see. So you could either take the triangle third, or you could take the line third. So you could go main, natural, line, right? line up here. So let's talk about both of these camps. Both of these potential bases to expand to. What are their benefits and what are their negatives? And why is it that I see mostly everybody go for this base? So the first thing I want to talk about is distance from your opponent. This base, in general, you want your bases to be far away from your opponent. You want it to take them longer to get to you so that you have a longer time to respond and you have an easier time defending against it. So if we actually, I mean, I could even send a unit to each of these if I wanted to, and we could time it. It seems very clear, though, that this base is a little bit closer. Just because from main to this base here is not very far, whereas this guy is on one sort of edge of the map down here, and their main is up over here. We usually track distance from main to whatever base you're talking about. So this base is farther away, so it has that going for it. That's good. The next thing we can talk about is defensibility. What is sort of the environment around it? Why would we favor certain conditions, and why would we want to avoid certain conditions? This base is what we would call a low ground base. So in Stormgate, right, we have low ground, we've got like neutral ground or middle ground, and then there's high ground up here. So in this map, for instance, there's 3 tiers of elevation, right? High, middle, and low. And there's nothing else. I don't think there's a 5th one. I guess this is technically like even higher. So yeah, this is like super high. Sure, whatever. Low ground bases are typically going to be worse. Why is that? Because if there's a cliff nearby, your opponent is going to have a much easier time sitting on top of this cliff. They could siege up atlases, they could have their long range units, and they can basically attack into this base for free and do some harassment damage. Your Therium is over here, they could hit your imps or your workers, whatever it might be. And this base has the added negative of having a ramp. And ramps are very good if you're on the high ground, and ramps are horrible if you're on the low ground in general. Fighting up into high ground is generally awful. Because if I'm going to fight this situation here, right? Like, let's pretend my opponent has an army over here. I have an army down here. I have to walk through this ramp here, where all my opponent needs to do is get a really nice looking concave, whereas my units will be convexing. They will be a smaller arc, if you will. And that's in general just terrible. The third negative thing about this base is there's a siege camp. It's actually legitimately right next to it. So this is in my opinion, it's an absolutely fucking crazy base to take for your third. This makes no sense at all. There's like no benefit to this base. It's all negatives. The only benefit being it's relatively far from your opponent. Yeah. Resource-wise, these bases are the same. They both have Illuminite mine. They both have Therium. They have this over here. One of the... So if we look at the negatives versus positives of this base, positive, the shrine is very close to both the Therium and the Illuminite, so you're going to get really solid efficiency on both of those. You don't have to make any additional structures if you don't want to. And it's far away from your opponent's base, but it's also pretty far from your main. So that might actually even cancel out, but I'll give it a pro. Cons. It is low ground, which is just always basically a bad thing. It has a ramp going up into the high ground, and then there's a siege camp that's right next to it. Okay, and we'll talk about the other creep camps here in a second. I promise it will come up. Okay, so this base does not have a lot of positive for it. This is what I would consider a late game base, where you've mined out your side of the map, and now you're expanding towards the middle into more dangerous territories. Okay, let's look at this base. So this was our line third. This was our other potential third that we could go for. What are the positives? What are the negatives? So let's start with the positives here. It's high ground. So that's fantastic. That means that your opponent has to naturally fight up into a choke point here. They have to go up a ramp in order to hit your base, which means you can get some free DPS. It also has, you know, Therium and Luminite resources, so that's pretty beneficial as well. And it's not very far away from your main. It's probably like walking distance. It's about the same, I would imagine, over to this base here. But you have a lot more area that you can work with. It's a bigger platform. It's a bigger surface, which for you can utilize the benefits of it a bit easier than your opponent can. Because typically you can choke these areas off here. Choke this area off.
Hey, any friend of this guy is a friend
make a
of
bunch of
John
structures
Gabba
that you can put all your units in and attack with. Neuro, thank you so much for the raid, man. This is a topic Neuro knows a ton about. Neuro can talk about this topic for ages if you want to. So guys, welcome everybody. And we were just looking at this base here as a potential third base to take instead. You have high ground here, which is great. You have a lot of area that your army can take advantage of where the opponent is going to be forced to go up these ramps here. It's a little bit closer to your opponent, which is a bit negative, but I would say in general, it's going to be closer to your natural production and your main production. So it's going to be easier for you to reinforce. Now, what are some of the other benefits that we have here? It's near a vision camp. So actually, you should have a lot of heads up and a lot of warning if you're about to be attacked at this space for a number of reasons. One, it's awkward to fit an army through these areas here, these little choke points. These are natural chokes that make it difficult for your opponent to attack into you. The easiest path for them to go is generally going to be some combination of going over here or using this main kind of causeway. So this vision camp, if you control it, gives you a lot of heads up, a lot of warning. So that's great for us. We love that. Okay. Now, one other thing I want to talk about is the creep camps. I think one of the ways that you could look at bases in this game is not only for expansions. Oh, one thing I did miss. One negative, because we did it with this one here. A negative that this camp does have, this base rather, has over this one, is that your shrine, if you get peak efficiency for Illuminite, is going to be farther away from your Therium. So that is a negative, and that actually does really impact this decision-making a lot. What was I saying before? So I was talking about the camps. You can think of your bases as sort of camp buffers. Camp protection, right? You want to be able to defend those camps easily. You want to be able to control the area that's around them so that when they respawn, you're going to have an easier time going and retaking them, or if your opponent tries to run in a few units, you'll be able to defend it very quickly. Bases typically seem to have camps that they are defending, for a lack of a better term. And the one that's over here at the third or at your line third, is much more valuable. This Luminite camp here, this resource camp. This one is very, very valuable to take. High amount of resources that you can gain off of it. And for the 5 minutes that you hold this, it generates even more resources. Whereas this third only generates energy camp. Like, it only protects, I should say, the energy camp. Which is pretty far away from your opponent and close to your main anyways. So I don't feel like this tower is not only really worth defending, it's not very attractive for your opponent to take away from you, whereas the Luminite tower is. So if we take the triangle third here and we take this Luminite tower, we're just not really going to be able to have a presence up here naturally. In order to defend this area and retake this camp. So let's keep going. Let's look at the fourth bases. So let's imagine we take this line third here. Fourth base progression is typically a bit easier to figure out even than your third. You can take the line fourth, which once again, we're following this line up the map. We're staying sort of away from our opponent's side of the map, and we're not really going towards this middle here. Now, if we apply the same principles, the line fourth is on high ground. Very large area for you to have to defend. But nice choke points that make it easy to kind of cut off access and make it difficult for your opponent to get up here. The Therium and the Luminite are close together. And once again, you're protecting this Therium camp. You have high ground advantage here. So you can actually even create maybe some towers here to get some pot shots off against this. And you get access to potentially, I think a tower may fit here and might be able to defend this. I'm not sure. Certainly if you kill these trees, you could put one here. And now you have high ground protection for this Luminite camp. So you're sort of able to screen for both camps. So this is a wonderful base. It's going to be by far your farthest base away. So if you were to take this as a fourth base instead, that would be closer. But you still have to contend with all those other negatives. Being on low ground, being next to a ramp, being right next to the siege camp. So I just really feel like this base in general, it's not very good. And again, it's not protecting anything worth protecting. And it also, to go even further with this, it has an awkward expansion pattern. So let's imagine you take this as your third. In order to take your fourth base, you have to go over here anyways. I mean, I suppose you could try to do this, but that's like unhinged. That's like you're weaving your way all the way through and up and around, and it's kind of crazy to do that, right? It's very easy, more easy for your opponent to access it. It's so close to your opponent's main and natural. This is a very dangerous base, so I wouldn't even consider this your fourth, like a potential fourth. This is now your stealing bases from your opponent, which there's certainly time and place to do that. So you take this as your third. Now you have to take this as your fourth. And the fourth is obviously going to happen later than your third base is. And by that point in the game, it might be more difficult for you to defend this base. Whereas if you take this as your third and this as your fourth, your power is more collecting into this wall here. Whereas if you do this triangle pattern here, you run into this strange like problem where you have to not only defend over here, but now you have to also defend over here, and it's just the distance between this is too great. Whereas if you kind of collate yourself first at your natural, you have equidistant to defend your main and your third, and then when you take your fourth, you can kind of play towards this third area, and you have this vision camp to show you if you're going to get attacked. You have this area that you can kind of collect around and then quickly go to defend your fourth or go to defend your natural. So yeah, in general, I think the line expansion pattern in this map is absolutely the way to go. And in fact, I don't even think this is a base worth taking unless it's super late and you just have nothing else to do. There are these weird island bases. These are sort of gimmicky expansions. Certainly there's a time and place for them. And obviously Celestials can take these way, way, way easier than any other faction can. But these are like very difficult to get to, extremely difficult to defend, requires specialized technology to even get to them. And then once you're here, you can only mine Luminite. There's no Therium. Okay, let's go look at another map. Isle of Dread. This is another map that has a very contentious expansion pattern. Very strange expansion pattern. And I see everybody doing the same thing. And I don't know if it's correct. I don't know if it's wrong. I'm not an expert at RTS by any means. But I think about RTS a lot. So once again, we have our main, obviously. We're spawning in here. But our decision making happens immediately. Whereas in the previous game, your natural was very, very easy to understand where to place it. You have to decide where you're going to go for your natural straight away. Are you going to go here to the double Luminite base? 2 Luminite mines, poggers, or are you going to go over here? So let's apply our same ideas that we applied in the last game. Okay, resource-wise, we finally have a difference between expansions. This one, again, Luminite mines. This one, Luminite and Therium. So you get 2 mines here. You get Therium, you get Luminite at this one. Now, this can definitely affect your strategy. If you're going for maybe like a 3 or 4 Iron Vault all in, it may be more beneficial for you to take the double Luminite mines because you're just going to be producing Luminite units. In the early game especially, having a higher Luminite count in general is going to be better. But that doesn't mean that Therium is a wasted resource. In fact, it's quite important in order for you to hit these upgrade timings and things like that. Let's look at the environments around here. They're both on, again, that neutral ground. There's no high ground, there's no low ground for either of these bases, so those basically cancel out.
Guy is a friend of
Thank you so much
John
for the follow. Appreciate
of
it.
Necro Goblin.
One big difference, though, one key difference, I would say, between these bases
any friend of
is the
this
area
guy is a friend of John
that you have to defend.
of Necro Goblin.
Thanks for the follows, guys. Really appreciate it. The areas that you have to defend. This section here, if you, let's say you have a shrine here, you have an entrance to your natural from the north and then also from the east. So that means that you need to double your efforts to defend this area completely, as well as try to prevent potentially just people bypassing this and going straight for your main. Your main is relatively open and can be approached on both sides. Now, I would say that this base does a much better job of protecting the speed camp. Because not only for, well, I would say especially for Infernal, because we can actually just put a meat farm here. And so long as there's a fell hog sitting in the circle, which just barely goes past these trees, your opponent won't be able to cap this. So it can be very, very hard for them to actually cap this. Behind this, there's a bunch of trees, which in the early game is basically as good as a wall, because there's not really going to be any units that are going to be able to go through this. But in the late game, it's a bit disastrous because, you know, Megalodons could stomp through, Vulcans could stomp through, and then they're at the critical sort of throat, if you will, of your base, which you want to be protecting the most. Not the worst area in the world, though. This is actually a fairly decent base. And again, you get that added benefit of being very close to the speed camp. Let's take a look at this one. It is probably, again, equidistant to your main. I wouldn't really say the distance between these two is a big factor. This base is a bit closer, I think, to your opponent. It depends on which expansion they go for. But in general, being closer to the center of the map usually means you're going to be closer to your opponent. But it's not by much, so I don't think that really plays in too much. Now, this one has a super giga wall. So there is not going to be anything that's going to be able to harass through this other than flying units. There are these strange trees sort of back here, but I'll get to those in a second. Again, in the early game, this is as good as a wall, unless they do something super cheeky and bring like a worker. And you have a much easier time defending this area, as there's only one entrance in and one entrance out. You don't really have to worry about it. One thing to note, though, is that, again, it's not very close to your speed camp. So you're going to have a harder time holding this. Your opponent might be able to take that speed camp quicker if you go for your natural here. But in general, I would say this is a much more defensible base than this one. This is a lot harder of a base to defend against. Let's look at the next thing, though. Let's pretend for a second we take each of these as our natural. So if you take this as your natural, the clear and obvious choice is then to take this as your third. And I think this really kind of messes some stuff up, though, because you now have, like, doubled your area of defense. And that's very difficult to deal with because you have so many entrances now into your area. So if you take this triangle, let's assume this triangle is now our area of influence. How many entrances are there into our area of influence here? Well, we have this area here, 1, we've got 2, we've got 3. If they break into this area over here, then there's so many paths for them that they are able to take now in order to threaten us. And we need to defend all of these simultaneously, right? The distance between these bases, too, is pretty large. And in general, you want to sit your units at a central location to your newest expansion But that can be somewhat dangerous in this situation because it'd be over here. You're not next to any of your buildings. You're not next to any of your towers. If you're infernal, you're not next to your meat farms. And if you decide to back up one direction, your opponent might just decide to go the other direction. So it's very awkward. It's a very awkward angle to try to defend against. Let's imagine you take this as your third. Your natural. Believe it or not, you do have a choice. Might not look like it. You could go for this as your third, and then you would run into the same problems that I mentioned before. Or you could attack through the trees here, create a little pathway in between, and take this space. And this is the line expansion pattern. So this goes into Therium, Luminite Therium into Luminite Therium. Which again, depending on your strategy, maybe that's totally acceptable. Or maybe it's kind of wasted and you don't really need to do that. Hard to say. Just depends on what you're trying to go for. But this way, this expanding sort of expansion pattern opens up a lot of interesting possibilities. It makes going to a fourth base easier, which would be over here. Or you could do double Luminite at any of these points, but I feel like having your units being able to centrally locate and then be able to easily go between your bases to defend is a bit better. You do reduce the attack surface of your bases. You have a very small choke here, relatively small choke here, and then this choke here. Technically this one as well, which you could block off if you wanted to, but that's quite a distance that your opponent would have to go before they were to get to you. Again, though, the camps, let's look at the camps that you're able to defend. Not many with this. Just the energy tower, which again is kind of the worst camp in the game currently. It's good, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely not. It ain't no Therium tower. Okay, let's put it that way. But if you do take this as your natural and you take this as your third, then your fourth base is really easily sort of gathered here. And you have this, once again, kind of wall that you're creating. Whereas if you go for this double Luminite, and then you go for that expansion pattern, you have this awkward, like, hanging area that you always need to be vigilant about. So, not to say that it's wrong to expand here, because getting double Luminite early is quite good. But just I think for a macro game, it might actually be a little easier and better for you to expand in the line pattern here. I don't think every faction would be able to take full advantage of the double Luminite here. Maybe Celestials would be the best for it, because you would still need to get a very high number of workers. Keep in mind, like, unless you're not expanding to a third, like, if you're gonna all in off of 2 base, like, this seems like the base you would want to take for sure. Like, I would agree with that. But if you do want to play it to 3, 4, 5 bases, then this might be a bit of a trap. But maybe not. Maybe you like that. Maybe you like having the speed camp easily defended, and you don't mind having a bit of an awkward defense angle for your third. It's totally possible. Cool. Let's go to one more map here to really just try and nail in the ideas I'm trying to talk about. Okay, Broken Crown. This is the last map I'm looking at here. This is an interesting one as well. This is one of the first maps that they created, actually, for Stormgate. This is, I think, when I was able to play this game before it was even in closed alpha, when I visited Frost Giant Studios, this was the map I played on. So this map has been in the pool for eons. There used to be creep camps over here. There used to be trees and a creep camp here and a creep camp here. It's crazy, man. Anyways. So, Broken Crown. No decisions to be made for our natural. It's this base 100%. 100%. But let's take a look at the thirds that we can take. We have 2 options. There's this one here, the low ground third, which only has 1 resource, the Luminite camp. Or there's this one here. The Break Through the Trees Luminite Therium Camp. Now this one's a bit tricky because I think that there are solid benefits and pretty big negatives to both of these expansions. So it really comes down to what you're comfortable with. If we take a look at this one, the Triangle Third, you get access to Therium and Luminite, so that's great, right? Those are the resources that we want to collect. You have High Ground, which is phenomenal. You have a ramp into your base, so you can easily choke it off with towers and structures. It's extremely close to your natural. I can almost fit both mines on the same screen. So it's super easy to go between your third and your natural here and defend both of these bases with relative ease. The reinforcement distance from your main is also very low. So overall, this base is very good. It's far away from your opponent. It's about as far as it gets. It's an awkward angle for them to try to attack into. It doesn't follow and use that main causeway here either. I would say it's not really protecting the speed camp. You could do some stuff here, but going down and around, you're closer to it. So it's not a negative, but I certainly wouldn't say it's a buffer for it. Now let's look at this third. Low ground, or neutral ground, I should say. This isn't low ground technically. This is just like the regular ground on the map. Only Luminite, so no Therium to be mined at this base. So that's a pretty big negative. Solid choke points though, over here, and protects the health camp a little bit more easily. So you do have that added benefit where you can try to take advantage of this. Now it is an awkward spot for it to be, because typically your base is going to be on this side so that it's closer to your natural, easier to defend, and you choke off this area a bit more. So your opponent might actually be able to take this camp and then retreat to this area as a quick healing spot. So that is a bit awkward. The one benefit I think this base has over this one, because this one seems so far like the clear winner to me, is that you're going to have an easier time expanding to your fourth. You're going to have an easier time expanding to your fourth. Your fourth being over here, sort of completing this line expansion. And then you have a pocket fifth base. That's what I would like to call this, is a potential pocket fifth base. Or a pocket fourth. If you're losing map control, boom, you can always have this base in your back pocket. In general, it's going to be easier for you to expand slightly more aggressively in the early game because units aren't as high tech and siege units aren't available. Whereas if you're trying to push out of your base into this area and this area, and it's already 10-15 minutes in the game, that might be a bit more difficult to achieve. So this one is trickier, honestly. I find myself going to this base more than I thought I would. I did not think I would be expanding here as often. But I find that having Therium at your natural already, I don't find I need it for my third to have it as well. And being able to easily go into a fourth base here and having early game buildings being put down gives me an easier time transitioning to get to this fourth base. And then again, you can always just take this fifth base pretty easily. But I don't think it's wrong to take this base as your third, or your fourth, for that matter. Maybe even as a fourth base, it might be a little better. It's very awkward for your fourth here, because your Therium is like downstairs. You have to create another structure here. You're super exposed, and you're right next to the vision camp. So just in general, this is, as a fourth base, is awful. I hate this base. The only benefit it has is that it's high ground here and it's relatively easy to choke off these points. Yeah, so really, guys, all I wanted to try to achieve with this is kind of talk through my thought process on expansion patterns, why I think some bases are better than others, things that you might want to keep in mind and think about when you're looking to expand, thinking about what sort of strategy am I going for. Do I want to expand more closely to my opponent? There are even strategies I'm sure that will develop that take this as your third, so that you can have a very aggressive presence and reinforce your army on the other side of the map more quickly. We saw stuff like that in StarCraft 2 all the time, where you would take an extremely aggressive expansion just so that you have that map presence and you can try and push out. Now, again, it's a very aggressive play. But hopefully this was helpful. I just find it very interesting when I watch other players, even pro players, expand in Stormgate. And I don't fully understand their thought process behind it. So if you guys have any comments on this, any questions or things that you think I've gotten wrong, or if you want to share why you expand to the bases that you do, or what you think about when you're expanding, I would love to hear about it. I think expanding in Stormgate is a lot more interesting and dynamic than people give it credit for. And I think the creep camps give that a lot of purchase, as well as the resource amounts and types available at each base. I think it really drives a lot of thinking to be done in not only the maps we have now, but future map design. So, very cool, guys. Thanks for listening. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I appreciate you very much. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you know when I'm going to be posting some new videos. But if you're here on Twitch right now, you can say hi to the YouTube if you want. This is your one opportunity to do so. I almost never make YouTube videos on stream. So, there you go, guys. This is your one and only opportunity. I leave it to you all. But we'll call that done. We'll call that done.